Let me ask you something. What would happen if the United States suddenly disappeared from the world map? Not declined, not weakened, but completely gone. No Washington, no New York, no US military bases, no American economy, no dollar. Would the world collapse overnight, or would it quietly reorganize itself? At first, this sounds like a science fiction question, but asking, what if the US disappeared, helps us understand just how deeply the United States is woven into the global system, often in ways we don't consciously notice. Start with geography. The United States sits between two vast oceans and connects major trade routes across the Atlantic and the Pacific. If it vanished, global shipping routes wouldn't just lose ports, they would lose one of their main stabilizers. Insurance costs would spike, shipping timelines would change, entire trade patterns would have to be redesigned. Now think about money. What happens if the world's largest economy disappears overnight? What happens to the US dollar? The currency used in most global trade, energy deals, and financial reserves. Banks across the world would freeze. Stock markets would shut down. Central banks would scramble to decide which currency replaces the dollar. And no alternative is ready to take that role instantly. The result wouldn't be a smooth transition. It would be financial shock. Then there's security. The United States doesn't just defend itself. It underwrites security across Europe, East Asia, and parts of the Middle East. If it disappeared, alliances like NATO would lose their backbone overnight. Countries that rely on US protection would face a brutal question. Do we rearm quickly or accept vulnerability? That moment of uncertainty is where danger lives. Regional rivals would test borders. Long-frozen conflicts could reignite. Nuclear deterrence calculations would change in days, not decades. But here's where the question becomes even more uncomfortable. Would the world unite to fill the gap? Or would it fracture into competing power blocks? Some might assume that without the US, the world would finally become more equal. But power doesn't vanish. It redistributes. Strong states don't wait politely for consensus. They move to secure advantage. China, Russia, regional powers, all would rush to protect their interests. Smaller nations would be forced to choose sides, often against their will. And then there's culture and technology. Hollywood, Silicon Valley, global platforms, innovation hubs. All gone, not gradually replaced, instantly removed. The global flow of ideas, technology, and influence would slow, then splinter. Different regions would develop separate systems, standards, and digital ecosystems. The world wouldn't end, but it wouldn't stay familiar either. So the real question isn't whether the United States is perfect. The real question is the world prepared for the shock of a system that suddenly loses its central pillar? If the United States disappeared, the most immediate question would not be why it happened. It would be who moves first. Because in global politics, power vacuums are never left unattended. China would likely be the fastest to act, not out of ideology, but necessity. China's economy depends heavily on global trade routes, energy imports, and stable markets. Without the U.S. Navy safeguarding sea lanes, China would be forced to expand its military presence far beyond its current scope. That expansion would not be welcomed quietly. Regional neighbors, Japan, India, Vietnam, Australia, would respond by strengthening their own defenses. What once looked like distant rivalries could quickly turn into open arms races. Would China replace the US as the new global leader? Unlikely, at least not smoothly. Leadership requires trust, not just strength. Many countries tolerate US dominance because its system, despite flaws, has been predictable. China's model is still viewed with suspicion by much of the world. Without a single accepted leader, coordination would become harder, not easier. Russia, meanwhile, would see opportunity in chaos. Regions where U.S. influence once acted as a brake. Eastern Europe, parts of the Middle East, Central Asia, would become more volatile. Without the U.S. acting as a balancing force, local conflicts could escalate faster and last longer. But the biggest impact would be felt by smaller nations. Countries that once relied on U.S. backed rules would now have to negotiate directly with regional powers. And negotiations between unequal partners rarely end fairly. Political independence would remain on paper, but economic and security dependence would deepen. Then there's the global economy. Without the United States, there is no immediate replacement for its role as the world's consumer of last resort. Entire export driven economies would contract sharply. Supply chains built around American demand would collapse or be forced to restructure at enormous cost. Global institutions would struggle as well. Organizations like the IMF, World Bank, and even the United Nations were designed around U.S. participation. Without it, funding gaps would appear overnight. Decision making would slow. Enforcement would weaken. The world would not fall into complete anarchy, but it would become more fragmented. Instead of one dominant system, we would likely see multiple competing systems, different currencies, different trade rules, different security arrangements. Regional blocs would harden. Cooperation across blocs would become rare and transactional. And perhaps the most overlooked consequence would be psychological. For decades, global crises have ended with one assumption. Eventually, the U.S. will step in. Without that assumption, uncertainty becomes permanent. Markets would price in fear. Governments would plan for worst-case scenarios, not best outcomes. Trust, the invisible glue of global order, would erode. So, would the world survive without the United States? Yes, but it would be a world defined less by rules and more by raw,